What is the best DPS option? On the surface, it seems like a simple question, but it is far more nuanced and complex. That question, along with its answers, are both an issue caused by the game and parts of the community. You have countless people asking with countless people replying with varying answers. Like this season, the quest with Surrounded was the current debate over Lament and Other Swords for damage against Crota. While it does have the highest damage values, people don't always understand its activation conditions or ease of use. Like, if you don't keep enemies alive or always do damage by spawn, the perk will never proc. Or how about rockets? Those can lead to insane damage numbers with the likes of an Apex Predator with Reconstruction and Bait and Switch, or Cold Comfort with Envious Assassin. But again, those are truly maximized when you have a Gjallarhorn to buff the damage and a damage rotation. I'll present this question. Which of the following is the best DPS option? Parasite, Leviathan's Breath, or an Envious Assassin Bait and Switch Cold Comfort? The answer? All of them. And none of them. The reason? The question didn't present all the variables. Parasite is great for insanely short damage windows when you only have enough time to fire off one shot, like the Atrax boss fight in Deepstone Crypt. But after that, follow-up shots do significantly less and start to detract from sustained DPS. Looking at Leviathan's Breath, it's kind of the king of sustained DPS, however you do need the catalyst to make that happen and an easy to hit crit on the enemy. For rockets, it comes down to having a Gjallarhorn buff and filling the time between firing rockets and how often you have to reload. Firing and reloading after every shot will have solid total damage, but terrible DPS. And this is only part of the problem with DPS. How does one maximize buffs, debuffs, and surge stacking? What types of damage rotations can and should I use? What are good options for every scenario? And what does DPS actually mean? Now, that's too many topics for this video. Today, we'll focus on the core issue, explaining the term DPS and how, as a community, we can improve on its representation and discussion. Alright, DPS, or damage per second, is a metric used to compare the damage output of various sources as well as see how well different damage options do under different scenarios. Even though it is a simple metric, all DPS values aren't always comparable or tell the whole picture. Like, what was the reload method used? That impacts how quickly you can get back to firing the weapon, thus reducing the overall time. How much ammo is used, and do you have reserve boosting traits? This can impact the total damage dealt, which also impacts the time to fire all shots. Or, how about what enemy were you shooting? This is a big one for certain people in the community, as creators often go to an infamous Cabal or Ogre to do damage, but different weapons have different scalars based on the enemy's rank. Now these are just a few variables to tweak DPS values, and they are important in the overall conversation. My problem is that these aren't always conveyed properly, or they represent specified perfection. Meaning, you can't always compare one person's DPS values to another, be it different creators' videos, same creators' videos, or amazing damage spreadsheets from the likes of Aegis, RockDC, and Makes. This is meant as no disrespect to them or anyone talking about damage. I would just like to advocate for more transparency, consistency, and comparable information from the community as a whole when discussing this topic, as it is immensely complex. What I'm advocating for are three key factors: methodology, standardized categories, and core references. Now, we don't need everyone to agree on these things, that's a pipe dream, but ideally you consistently follow all three tenets and are transparent. Methodology is simple. What data are you using? How is it constructed? So, enemy you're testing on, reload speed and buffs, and total ammo. This provides the foundation of building and comparing your DPS values. An example of this would be, when talking about an ideal boss damage scenario, you'll have max ammo reserves, full ammo, a lunafaction well, and are fighting a boss rank enemy. You can then build upon this with other avenues of reload, like Rain of Fire or RDMs, and damage rotations, but this provides a baseline of methodology and comparative data. However, the two remaining factors are the bigger problems. Case in point, how many times do you hear, X weapon does 100,000 DPS from one person, and that same weapon does 1 million DPS when coming from another? Or how about, this is the best DPS weapon? Amongst all of this, you're missing two key details. What is the factor of time, and what are you comparing this to? Time is a very important part of DPS and is often lost or made unclear in the conversation. We use terms like burst, sustained, 1 mag, and total when talking about DPS, but these terms don't have solid definitions. I would like to change that, or at the very least present a clear way to represent what we're talking about both in name and iconography. As an endgame player, you'll learn that most boss fights and important targets generally fall into set timings. So, let us use them to define the different types of DPS. For the broad category of burst and 1 mag, let's change it to 1, 3, and 5 second scenarios. These all highlight small damage windows for the likes of Crypt Security and Atrax and DSC, champions you'll find everywhere, and several bosses and GMs you want to quickly burst down so you can trigger the next phase. By making the value of time front and center, you can then more transparently compare values and see what stands out. For the term sustained DPS, let's define it with the two most common damage scenarios, 10 seconds and 30 seconds. These describe boss fights like Shirochi, Caretaker, Rolk, and Nezarec, showcasing weapons that have more consistency in their DPS values, staying power, and more reserves. The last aspect, total damage, really isn't a metric of DPS as it doesn't have a timed component, but it can still be conveyed as such, you just need to make sure you express that length of time. This is a useful metric in identifying weapons that have an efficient ammo economy and are more suited for jack-of-all-trades scenarios, meaning it's decent at add clear, single target damage, and lengthy encounters. Now, I'm not saying these categories are perfect. I'd actually like your feedback to see if they make sense and if you find them useful. The purpose is just to make the numbers more transparent and for the average person to more easily sift through the data. The shorter the damage phase, the more important mag and reloading boost traits are, that's why I broke up the burst category into 1, 3, and 5 seconds. So that way you can more easily see what is going on. Then looking at the big picture, you can easily identify what is the best option you should use. Know that a damage phase is sub 10 seconds, then zoom in on those categories' datasets. The final core principle I'd like to advocate for is what I dub core references. These are a set of common damage options that provide a frame of reference to what type of DPS is being discussed so that everyone is on the same page. Saying X weapon does 100k 10-second DPS is cool and all, but I need to know what that means in terms of other weapons. Big number doesn't mean anything unless you contextualize it. So I'd like some core frames of references. This part, again, needs some workshopping and feedback as to what weapons or damage options should be used. My philosophy is that these references should all be options anyone and everyone can replicate, so at base, always available free-to-play options and no damage rotations. And that's a common theme for everything on my channel, trying to present information for the most amount of people, showing players that you don't need the meta weapons or DLC options to complete these activities. That's why I do free-to-play GMs and master raids to gather data and have video proof. Of course, we can still have what the best of the current meta is, like Cold Comfort and RDM super damage rotations, but that's so we can see where the active discussion topic lies on the whole spectrum of DPS and identify new damage rotations or power creep. Okay, so the core references I have in mind are as follows. For exotics, let's get the big ones from the Monument to Lost Lights kiosk. That's Outbreak Perfected to represent team primary DPS for day 1 raids or poor ammo economy scenarios, and then Sleeper Simulant, Whisper of the Worm, and Legend of Acreus to represent bosses with different hitboxes, distances, and damage phase lengths. You can also throw Merciless and Thunderlord on this list. Before you laugh and object, I hear you, Thunderlord isn't a top DPS option. However, it provides a point of comparison to show better options rather than just saying Thunderlord bad lol, as well as it can be a form of consistent DPS for players that maybe are inaccurate with rockets or time precision options. To further prove my case, it can work. The footage here is my team all using Thunderlord on Master Crota with Arc as a weekly surge. No div, no super spam with exotics that boost super damage. It is not the best, but it can work. If this is your best damage option, it's better than missing rockets or using a primary. But let's get back on topic. Now, the problem with all these options are they're kinda catalyst driven to perform at their best, but they provide achievable long-term goals to get solid damage options. Turning to legendary weapons, you have craftable weapons like Taipan, Palmyra, and Ragnhild that all players can get and craft immediately following the chain of crafting tutorial quests, with the other half in Wastelander as pursuit options from Dares of Eternity. Again, not the current meta options, but they are accessible and still good. Linear fusions are no longer the king, but they still do a great job. We can then round things out with broad categories comprised of playlist weapons. Provide name recognition with the likes of Riptide and Braytech Osprey, but maybe use more universal perk rolls like Vorpal or Explosive Light to provide more of a baseline representation of that weapon category. This is still something that needs to be workshopped. In the end, the goal is to provide a list of weapons that everyone can obtain without diving into the endgame, represent every category of DPS, and act as quick reference points to compare different damage options. Hopefully, my ramblings made a bit of sense, you learned a bit about DPS, and understand ways we can improve the discussion of the topic. Here, I'll also give another shout out to Aegis, who does excellent speedrun and optimal damage strategy work, as well as RockDC and Makes for their works on the D2 damage generator spreadsheet. They all make wonderful content and tools you should all check out if you want to get more educated on the topic and improve on your boss damage. Their socials and spreadsheets will be linked in the description, and I highly recommend you give them a follow. They are part of the inspiration for this video series, as I have learned so much and now wish to contribute to the conversation. If you have any questions or wish to talk more about the topic, feel free to write in the comments. I'm very open to feedback and ways the community can more freely talk about this subject, without the stigma it usually has. The next video in this DPS series will go over simple damage options everyone can obtain with relative ease of use. I mentioned a few already, but we'll expand that list and incorporate easy to acquire options from various expansions and touch on abilities. Simply, it'll be what everyone can and should get before they try endgame activities, so that they maximize their chances at success and minimize the issues that come from LFG and learning new activities. If you found this guide useful, a like would greatly support the channel. For more useful and accessible guides, check out my other content and subscribe to see what comes next. And if you want to discuss all things Destiny and learn how to do raids and dungeons, come swing by the Sundog Gaming Discord. As always, I'm your Commander Pika. Be kind, have fun, and I'll see you on the battlefield.